Who is the Lord, that I should obey his voice? I do not know this God, and I will not let Israel go.
In this video, we journey through one of the most gripping stories ever told, the story of Moses. From his flight out of Egypt as a wanted fugitive, through 40 years of silence in a foreign desert, to his earth-shaking return before the most powerful throne on earth. Through 10 catastrophic plagues, a sea torn open by the hand of God, and a nation finally walking free after 400 years in chains. This is the story of the exile who became a deliverer. The story begins in Egypt. Long after Joseph, the Hebrew who had once saved the nation, had died and been forgotten. The Israelites, also called Hebrews, had once been honored guests in the land of Egypt. Joseph's wisdom had saved Egypt from famine, and Pharaoh had welcomed his family with open arms. But generations passed. Joseph's name faded, and a new Pharaoh rose to power. One who did not know Joseph, did not honor his legacy, and did not care what he had done. This new Pharaoh looked out at the Hebrew people and felt something cold move through him. Not gratitude, not respect. Fear. They were too many, too strong, too unified. A people this size, he thought, could become a threat, or worse, an army for Egypt's enemies. And so, rather than honor them, he decided to break them. He enslaved them. The Hebrews were stripped of their freedom and driven into forced labor, hauling heavy stones under the burning Egyptian sun, mixing mortar, laying bricks, building cities and monuments for a king who saw them as tools, not people. Their backs bent, their hands bled. Their children grew up knowing nothing but chains. And still, they multiplied. The more Pharaoh crushed them, the stronger they became. It was as if their suffering only deepened their roots. So Pharaoh reached for something darker. He called the Hebrew midwives and gave them a command soaked in wickedness. Every Hebrew baby boy born must be killed at birth. Only the girls could live. Fear swept through every Hebrew household. Mothers gave birth in terror. Fathers held their newborn sons and wept. A death sentence hung over an entire generation of children, and no one could stop it. No one, that is, except God. And God had already chosen his instrument. He had already placed him, quietly, miraculously, in the one house in all of Egypt that no soldier would dare search, the house of Pharaoh himself. Among all the children raised in Pharaoh's palace, one was different. Moses grew up in linen and gold. He ate at the finest tables, walked marble corridors, and was schooled in the wisdom of Egypt's greatest minds. From the outside, he had everything a man could want: power, privilege, and a future painted in royalty. But something inside him would not rest, because every time he looked beyond the palace walls, he saw them, his people, hunched under the weight of stone, driven by whips, building monuments to a kingdom that owned their bodies but could never own their souls. He knew who he was. He had always known. One day it became too much to watch. An Egyptian taskmaster was beating a Hebrew slave, not working him, destroying him. Something ancient and fierce rose up in Moses. He looked one way, then the other. No one watching. And in one explosive moment, the prince became something else entirely. The Egyptian fell. Moses buried him in the sand and walked away, hoping the desert would keep his secret. It would not. The next day, the whispers had already started. 2 Hebrews argued in the dirt, and when Moses tried to intervene, one of them turned on him with words sharper than any blade. "Are you going to kill me like you killed the Egyptian?" The secret was out. And when Pharaoh heard it, the order came swiftly. "Find Moses. Kill him." So Moses ran, not in royal robes, not with an escort or a title. He ran as a fugitive, with nothing but the clothes on his back and the weight of everything he had just destroyed. The palace, the future, the name, all of it, gone, in a single moment of conscience. He ran until Egypt was behind him, and nothing was ahead of him but sand. Midian was not a destination. It was simply where his legs stopped. a dry, forgotten stretch of land east of the Sinai wilderness, where the wind moves slower than time and nobody asks questions about your past. Moses arrived with nothing, no title, no inheritance, no story he was willing to tell. Just a man, just dust, just silence. But God was already there ahead of him. At a well on the outskirts of Midian, Moses met 7 daughters drawing water for their father's flocks. When a group of rough shepherds tried to drive them away, that old instinct rose up in him again. The one that had cost him everything in Egypt. He stood, he defended them, he helped them water their flocks. And some things about a man simply will not stay buried, no matter how far he runs from himself. Their father Jethro, a priest of Midian, took him in without hesitation. Moses settled. He married Jethro's daughter Zipporah. He had sons, and slowly, season by quiet season, he let Egypt go. The marble corridors faded. The sound of whips grew distant. The man who had once worn linen and gold now wore the rough clothes of a shepherd, his hands calloused, his back bent not under oppression, but under the ordinary weight of an ordinary life. He made peace with being nobody. 40 years passed. 40 years of sand and sheep and sunsets that looked the same as the one before. The white crept into his beard. The fire faded from his eyes, or so it seemed. Moses had convinced himself that his story was over, that the man who had once burned with righteous fury was gone, were replaced by a quiet old shepherd who asked nothing of the world and expected nothing in return. He was wrong. One afternoon on the far side of the wilderness near the mountain of Horeb, Moses was doing what he did every day, leading the flock, watching the ground, thinking nothing remarkable. And then something caught his eye. A bush was on fire. That was not unusual in the desert. Dry scrub caught flame all the time under the punishing heat. But Moses slowed his steps, because something was wrong. Or rather, something was impossibly right.
A bush that burns but is not consumed. Surely this is a sign from the divine.
The bush was burning, yes, but it was not burning up. The flames danced and roared and consumed nothing. Every branch stayed intact. Every leaf held. The fire burned without destroying. Moses stopped walking. He stood there, this weathered old man with his shepherd's staff and his forgotten past, staring at something that had no natural explanation. And then, almost against his own will, he turned toward it. And that single turn, that one small step toward the impossible, was the moment his quiet life ended forever. He did not know it yet, but God had known exactly where he was the whole time. The voice came from inside the fire, not a whisper, not a feeling, a voice, clear, present, and unlike anything Moses had ever heard in all his years in Pharaoh's court or all his decades in the desert. It called his name, and Moses, trembling, answered the only way a man can answer when heaven speaks directly to him. Here I am. The ground beneath his feet was suddenly sacred. God told him to remove his sandals, and Moses obeyed without question. Bare feet on holy earth, an old shepherd standing before the Eternal. Then the voice identified itself. I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, the God of his fathers, the God of the promises made centuries before Moses was born. And he had something to say. I have seen the suffering of my people in Egypt. I have heard their crying. I know their sorrows, and I have come down to deliver them. Moses must have felt something crack open in his chest at those words. 40 years of buried grief, 40 years of a people he had left behind, still suffering, still in chains. God had not forgotten them. Not a single tear, not a single cry had gone unnoticed. Every crack of the whip had been heard. Every broken back had been seen. And then came the words that changed everything. I am sending you. The silence that followed those 4 words must have been deafening. Moses, this old man, this nobody, this fugitive with blood on his hands and doubt in his bones, began to push back. Not once, not twice. 5 times he threw up a wall, and 5 times God dismantled it with patience and power. Who am I to go to Pharaoh? God answered, "It does not matter who you are. I will be with you. What is your name? What shall I tell them?" Our God answered, "I am who I am. Tell them I am has sent you." The self-existing, never beginning, never-ending God who needs no introduction and answers to no one. What if they don't believe me? God answered with miracles, a staff that became a serpent, a hand turned leprous and restored, water transformed to blood. Signs powerful enough to silence every skeptic. I am not eloquent. I am slow of speech. God answered with a question that silenced every excuse. Who made your mouth? And then, a promise. I will be with your lips. I will teach you what to say. Please, send someone else. That one cost Moses something. God's anger burned, but his mercy burned brighter. He gave Moses, his brother Aaron, a man of words, to stand beside him and speak what Moses could not. Every wall had been answered. Every excuse had been met. There was nothing left to hide behind. So Moses went, not striding forward in confidence, not burning with heroic fire. He went quietly, obediently, to staff in hand, a broken man walking back toward everything he had fled. And that was exactly enough. Egypt had not changed. The same sun hammered the same dust. The same crack of whips echoed across the same brick fields. The same broken people moved under the same merciless sky. But something was different now, because walking back through the gates of the land he had fled was an old man with a shepherd's staff and a brother at his side, carrying a message from the God of heaven. Moses was back. He and Aaron went first to the Hebrew elders, the leaders of the people who had survived generations of bondage with their faith barely intact. Moses told them everything: the burning bush, the name, the signs, the promise. And something extraordinary happened in that room. Men who had long since stopped expecting anything from God began to weep. Not from sorrow, from hope. A hope so long deferred, it almost hurt to feel again. They bowed their heads and worshipped. After 400 years of silence, God had spoken, and he had not forgotten them. But the harder meeting was still ahead. The throne room of Pharaoh was everything Moses' shepherd life was not. Vast, cold, built to make men feel small. Gold caught the light from every surface. Guards lined the walls. The air itself felt like a warning. And at the end of it all sat Pharaoh, tall, armored, draped in the authority of a man who believed himself divine. The cobra scepter rested in his hand like a reminder of who held power in this world. Moses and Aaron walked the length of that room and did not bow. The message was simple and unambiguous. The God of Israel says, "Let my people go, that they may worship him in the wilderness."
Pharaoh, the Lord God of Israel commands, "Let my people go. He has seen our suffering. You must obey." "I do not know your Lord."
Just a command delivered by two old men to the most powerful ruler on earth. Pharaoh's response was a laugh. Not a nervous laugh, not the laugh of a man who feels even slightly threatened. Oh, a dismissive, contemptuous laugh, the kind that says you are nothing and you have already lost. He leaned forward and asked the question he already knew would sting.
"Who is the Lord, that I should obey his voice? I do not know this God, and I will not let Israel go."
Then he made them pay for asking. He called his taskmasters and issued new orders immediately. The Hebrews would no longer be given straw to make their bricks. They would have to gather it themselves.
"You will double the workload. No more straw for the bricks. Let them find it themselves. Make them suffer."
But the daily quota would not decrease by a single brick. The workload doubled. The suffering deepened. And when the Hebrew foremen were beaten for falling short, they came to Moses with fire in their eyes and grief in their voices. "You have made us a stench before Pharaoh. You have put a sword in their hands to kill us." Moses stood there and absorbed every word. Then he turned to God and asked the question that every obedient person eventually asks in their darkest moment. "Why did you send me? Nothing is better. Everything is worse." The answer was coming, but first it had to get darker still. God had heard Moses' question, and his answer was not a whisper. It was war, not the kind fought with chariots and swords. Egypt had plenty of those. This was a different kind of war entirely. Systematic, surgical, divine. God was not simply inconveniencing Pharaoh. He was dismantling Egypt's entire world, piece by piece, God by God, until there was nothing left for Pharaoh to stand on but his own crumbling pride. It began at the Nile. The Nile was not just a river to Egypt. It was life itself, the source of their crops, their trade, their identity, their worship. Their god Hapi was said to dwell within its waters. So when Moses raised his staff over its surface and the water turned to blood, thick, dark, reeking, it was not just a plague. It was a statement. The God of Israel had just struck Egypt's greatest deity and left it rotting in the sun. Fish died by the thousands. The stench rose over the entire land. And Pharaoh walked back into his palace without a word, his heart as hard as the stone monuments bearing his name. Then came the frogs. Countless, unstoppable, impossible to ignore. They swarmed out of every waterway and filled every space. Bedrooms, kitchens, ovens. Even Pharaoh's own bed crawled with them. For one brief moment, Pharaoh cracked. He summoned Moses and begged for relief, promising to let the people go. Moses prayed. The frogs died. And the moment the crisis passed, Pharaoh's promise died with them. He hardened his heart again. So God struck the dust of the ground and lice rose like a living cloud, covering man and beast across all of Egypt. This was the moment Pharaoh's own magicians, men who had matched the first signs with their dark arts, finally broke. When they stood before Pharaoh with fear in their eyes and said words that should have changed everything, "This is the finger of God." Even his own men were telling him to stop. He would not listen. The flies came next, dense, suffocating swarms that ruined the land. Then the livestock of Egypt began to die, collapsing in the fields while every animal in Goshen remained untouched. Then boils erupted without warning across Egyptian skin, on the people, on the remaining animals, even on the magicians who could no longer stand before Moses because their own bodies were covered in festering sores. Then the sky cracked open. Hail fell like divine artillery, thunderous, relentless, and wrapped in fire. It destroyed crops, shattered trees, and killed everything left unprotected in the open fields. Those who feared God's word brought their servants and livestock inside and survived. Those who ignored it lost everything. Then came the locusts, a darkness of a different kind, rolling in from the east like a living storm, devouring every green thing the hail had left behind. Egypt was being stripped to the bone, and still Pharaoh would not yield. So God reached for something that needed no explanation. Thick, tangible darkness fell over Egypt. Not the ordinary darkness of night, but something that pressed against the skin and paralyzed every step. For 3 days, no Egyptian could see. No lamp burned. No one moved. The whole nation sat in a blackness so complete it felt like burial. But in Goshen, where the Hebrews lived, there was light. Pharaoh called Moses in one final time, wild-eyed and shaken, and offered a compromise. "Go, but leave your livestock behind." Moses refused. Everything goes or nothing goes. And Pharaoh, his pride rearing up one last time like a cornered animal, pointed his finger at Moses and said the words that sealed his own destruction. "Get out of my sight. If you see my face again, you will die." Moses looked at him steadily. "You are right," he said. "I will not see your face again." But there was one more plague coming, and nothing, no throne, no army, no hardened heart would survive it. God did not send this final plague without warning his people first. Before judgment moved through Egypt, mercy made its preparations. Moses gathered the Hebrews and delivered instructions so precise, so deliberate, that every detail carried the weight of something sacred. This was not just a survival plan. This was the beginning of a remembrance that would outlast every empire on earth. Each family was to select a lamb, not just any lamb, a spotless one, without blemish or defect, a life without flaw, chosen specifically to stand in the place of those inside the house. They would care for it, and then at twilight they would slaughter it. And the blood, that was the most important thing. The blood was to be taken and painted across the doorposts and the lintel of every Hebrew home, not hidden, not whispered about. Painted boldly, visibly, on the entrance of the house as a declaration. We are covered. Death does not live here. Then they were to eat, but not leisurely, standing up fully dressed, sandals on their feet, staff already in hand, roasted lamb, unleavened bread, bitter herbs, a meal eaten like people who already believed they were leaving. Because faith always acts before the door opens. They ate in the posture of freedom before freedom had arrived. And then they waited. Midnight came to Egypt like a held breath finally released. The destroyer moved through the land in silence, through streets, through markets, through the homes of nobles and servants alike. There was no negotiating with it, no last-minute bargain, no status or wealth that could redirect its path. It passed over every door marked with blood without pausing. When but every door unmarked, it entered. From the palace to the prison, Egypt convulsed in a single moment of catastrophic grief. Pharaoh's own son, his heir, his future, the continuation of his dynasty, was gone. The firstborn of the highest official and the firstborn of the lowest slave fell in the same terrible hour. There was not a house in Egypt without someone dead. The wailing that rose over Egypt that night was unlike anything the land had ever heard. It was the sound of an empire breaking. And in Goshen, there was silence and safety, and the quiet sound of a people finishing their meal and pulling their cloaks tighter, waiting for the word they had been promised.
I bear an urgent message from Pharaoh. Open the door. It is a matter of great importance.
It came before
Pharaoh's
dawn,
message for Goshen.
a knock at Moses'
Open
door,
in the name of Pharaoh.
urgent, desperate, stripped of all the arrogance that had filled every previous encounter. Pharaoh's messenger, pale and shaking, delivered the message his master could no longer speak with any pride. Get out, all of you. I take your flocks, your herds, everything. Go. And bless me also. The most powerful man on earth was begging the man he had once laughed out of his throne room to simply leave and to take his God with him.
I do not know this God.
The blood had done what no argument, no miracle, and no plague had been able to do alone. It had finally broken Pharaoh. They walked out in the middle of the night and the ground shook with their numbers. 600,000 men. And that was not counting the women, the children, the elderly, and the livestock, or the mixed multitude of others who joined them, swept up in the momentum of a God on the move. An entire nation in motion, pouring out of Goshen like a river that had finally broken its banks. They carried everything, their flocks, their tents, their bread that had not even had time to rise. And they carried something else too, gold, silver, jewelry, and fine clothing pressed into their hands by Egyptian neighbors who just wanted them gone, on who would give anything to end the grief that had settled over their land. Without knowing it, Egypt paid 400 years of unpaid wages in a single night. God led them himself, a pillar of cloud by day, stretching high above the column of marching people, and a pillar of fire by night, blazing ahead of them like a torch held by an unseen hand. They were not wandering, they were being led, every step guided, every direction chosen. The God who had seen their suffering was now walking with them out of it. But back in Egypt, something was stirring. The grief had barely dried on Pharaoh's face before his pride began to speak again. In the silence left by the Hebrews' departure, the old arrogance crept back in, whispering that he had made a mistake, that he had shown weakness.
It was but one terrible night. Egypt would have survived. We need to bring them back. I made a mistake. I should have never let them go!
That a king does not simply release his entire labor force because of one terrible night. He called his commanders. He called his charioteers.
We can cut them off here before they reach the Red Sea. I'll mark the routes now. Prepare the chariots.
600 of Egypt's finest war chariots rolled out of their stables, and Pharaoh rode at the head of them, his jaw set,
Forward for
his
the
eyes
glory of
hard,
Egypt!
convinced that he could still undo what God had done. The Hebrews saw the dust cloud on the horizon before they heard the thunder of hooves. Panic moved through the camp like wildfire. In front of them, the Red Sea, vast and impassable, offering no way forward. Behind them, the most feared army in the known world, closing fast. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, and the people, terrified and furious, turned on Moses with the full force of their fear. Was there not enough room to bury us in Egypt?
Did you bring us here to die? You should have left us in Egypt!
Why did you bring us here to die? Moses stood at the edge of the water and said words that could only come from a man who had stopped trusting in his own ability entirely. Do not be afraid, stand still, and watch what God will do. Then he raised his staff over the sea. The wind came first, a fierce, driving east wind that blew through the night and pushed the water back. And then the sea did something that water has never done before or since. It stood up. Two walls of churning water, held back by nothing visible, with a path of dry ground running straight between them. Moses stepped forward, then the people stepped forward, and one by one, then 10 by 10, then 1,000 by 1,000, the entire nation of Israel walked through the middle of the sea on dry ground, water towering on their left, water towering on their right, and the ground beneath their feet as solid as the promise that had brought them this far. Pharaoh's army followed them in, and the moment the last Hebrew foot touched the far shore, God told Moses to stretch out his hand once more. The walls collapsed. The sea roared back into place with a violence that left nothing behind. Chariots, horses, soldiers swallowed completely. The most powerful military force on earth, gone in moments, as if they had never existed. Israel stood on the other side and stared back at the water in the stunned, breathless silence. Then someone began to sing.
I will sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. He has become my salvation.
The song did not last as long as it should have. Well, 3 days after the greatest miracle any living person had ever witnessed, 3 days after walking through a sea on dry ground while walls of water stood at attention on either side, the Israelites were complaining. The water at Marah was bitter, they said, undrinkable. And instead of turning to the God who had just dismantled Egypt on their behalf, they turned on Moses with the sharp, familiar edge of people who have confused a deliverer with a servant. God sweetened the water, and he was patient. He had been patient for 400 years.
Ah, this water is sweet.
It's a miracle!
Truly a blessing.
But the wilderness has a way of revealing what prosperity conceals. Out here, stripped of the routine of slavery, which was brutal, but at least predictable, the Israelites discovered something uncomfortable about themselves. They did not know how to trust.
I'm so bored.
Me too. There's nothing to do. Tell me about it.
Same here.
They had spent 4 centuries with their heads down, surviving day to day, and now that survival required faith instead of endurance, where they found their faith embarrassingly thin. They cried out for food, and God sent manna, thin, frost-like bread that appeared on the ground every morning, like a gift that had to be received fresh each day. He sent quail in the evenings until meat filled the camp. He brought water out of solid rock when they were thirsty, not because they deserved it, but because he had made a promise and he intended to keep it. Every single morning the provision was there, and every single morning it asked the same quiet question, "Do you trust me today?" And every single morning the people struggled to answer yes. Then came the episode that broke something open entirely. While Moses was on Mount Sinai receiving the law, the very foundation of how this new nation would live before God, the people below grew restless. 40 days felt too long to wait for a God they could not see, so they melted down their gold. In the same gold Egypt had pressed into their hands on the night of the Exodus, and they shaped it into a calf and called it their deliverer. Moses came down the mountain with the tablets of God's law in his hands, and the sound of celebration in his ears, and found a people dancing before an idol at the foot of the very mountain where God had just spoken. The consequences were severe. They always are when people treat grace as permission to be faithless. What should have been an 11-day journey from Egypt to the Promised Land became 40 years of circular wandering. Not because God abandoned them, the cloud still led, the manna still fell, the pillar of fire still burned through every desert night, but an entire generation that had seen miracle after miracle and still chosen fear over faith would not be the ones to cross the finish line. They died in the wilderness with the promise still visible on the horizon, where freedom had been given to them freely, but faithfulness, that was something the wilderness was trying to build in them, one dry and difficult day at a time. And the hardest truth the desert teaches is this: God can break your chains in a single night, but he cannot make you trust him. That part is always yours to choose. He was 120 years old and his eyes had not dimmed. That detail matters, because what God was about to show him required a man who could see clearly, who could take in the full weight of what was before him without the mercy of blurred vision softening the edges. Moses would see everything, all of it, and he would see it perfectly. God led him up Mount Nebo, just the two of them, the servant and the one who had called him from a burning bush 8 decades before. Behind Moses lay the wilderness, the wandering, the manna-covered mornings and fire-lit nights, the weight of leading a million complaining, beloved, impossible people through 40 years of desert. Ahead of him, spread out beneath the open sky like a gift laid on an altar, was everything he had been walking toward. God showed him Gilead stretching northward, the territories of Dan and Naphtali, the land of Judah reaching all the way to the western sea, the Negev in the south, the valley of Jericho, the city of palms, glittering in the distance, the full sweep of the land he had promised to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, and to every generation that had held on to that promise through slavery and suffering and the long silence of unanswered years. Moses looked at all of it, and then God said the words that must have landed like a stone in still water. You will not cross over, not because the promise had failed, not because God had changed his mind about Israel or about Moses, but because at Meribah, in a moment of exhaustion and anger, when Moses had struck the rock instead of speaking to it, one act of disobedience, one fracture in a lifetime of faithfulness, and the God who is rich in mercy is also unwilling to pretend that the choices of his servants carry no weight. It was just, and it was painful, and both of those things were true at the same time. There is no record of Moses arguing, no record of him weeping or raging against the sentence. The man who had once offered 5 objections at a burning bush had nothing left to say here, only the quiet acceptance of someone who has walked with God long enough to trust him, even in the moments that hurt the most. Moses died there on the mountain, and God, and with a tenderness that defies full understanding, buried him himself. No tomb, no monument, no grave that future generations could locate or venerate. Just a valley in the land of Moab, and a secret kept between heaven and earth. Israel mourned him for 30 days. 30 days of grief for the man who had stood between them and Pharaoh, between them and destruction, between them and their own worst impulses more times than anyone could count. But the promise did not mourn. The promise crossed the Jordan without him. Because that is the final staggering truth this story leaves behind. God's purposes are never buried with his servants. Moses was gone, but the land remained. The covenant remained. And God raised up Joshua and the march continued. Because what God begins, no human failure can permanently stop. The promise always survives the person.